your third exam. So I believe the TA is working on it right now. So hopefully over the weekend he worked really hard. So your score will be available next week. Hopefully only next week. So if it is before our class on Tuesday, we will talk about the exam on Tuesday. If not, then we will talk about the exam on Thursday. But sometime next week, your scores will be posted on the e-learning website. And then chapter 11, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination. Obviously, this is a really important topic. It has lots of implications for our society, maybe possibly for your life as well. So I really want this class to be very informative and helpful and possibly interesting. So stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. How can you define this? So first question I have is this. What's the difference between stereotype and prejudice? Obviously they are similar to each other, but what do you think their differences? Prejudice is more negative, right? Yeah, that's right.
I feel like stereotypes can sometimes be a product of prejudice.
So stereotype is the product of prejudice. So they are very similar to each other, but we need definition. Okay. So stereotypes beliefs about other groups. So it's knowledge we have. So it's cognitive knowledge. Certain beliefs. So prejudice is attitude. Not just knowledge, but it's attitude. And then like you said, it's more negative. Stereotypes can be positive as well. Knowledge about other group can be positive, right? But prejudice is negative. Negative attitude. Superficially, it may look positive, that's possible, but eventually, its consequences is always negative. So prejudice is negative attitude. Sometimes it may look positive, but like I said, the consequences of prejudice is always negative. Then having negative attitude toward the other group can generate stereotypes. So, like you said, stereotypes may be the product of prejudice. And then the other way around is also true. Your prejudice may be based on your knowledge about that group. And then obviously the knowledge about other groups can be true, but can be false as well. So the stereotype is not directly relevant to the accuracy. Sometimes it's correct, sometimes it's wrong. So regardless of its accuracy, the knowledge about the other group, that's a stereotype. Then what is discrimination? That's actual behavior based on prejudice or stereotype. So unfair treatment of members of a particular group based on their membership. So basically negative behaviors based on stereotype or prejudice. That's discrimination. So can you see the difference between them? So stereotype, knowledge, prejudice, attitude, discrimination, behavior.
So you have a stereotype about someone, and then you prejudice someone, and then you would do discriminatory behavior based surveys.
So they are related to each other. And then in everyday life, you can use them interchangeably. But in psychology, these are their differences. One is knowledge, another is attitude, the other is behavior. So prejudice is attitude. So when we talked about the attitude, there are three components of attitude, ABC of attitude. Affect, behavior, and cognition, right? So same thing can be applicable to prejudice as well. So there is ABC of prejudice. Negative affect, hate. Behavior, that's discrimination basically. And cognition, knowledge, that's related to stereotype. So prejudice is closely related to stereotype and discrimination. Okay. So modern racism. So we are going to talk about racism, but the content itself is not that critical. So whatever group you may have, you can applicable to this language to that group. For example, gender, modern sexism. Any kind of socially constructed group, that's what we are going to talk about. Right? So for example, there is much variation in terms of ethnicity in the US, right? African Americans, European Americans, Hispanic Americans, or Asian Americans, or Native Americans, right? But for example, in Korea, there is no variation in terms of ethnicity. So everyone is just Korean. No European Koreans or Hispanic Koreans. Koreans is just single ethnicity. But still, there are socially constructed groups in Korean society as well. There is no variation in terms of ethnicity, but there is much variation. There is much variation in terms of dialect. Right? So some portion of Koreans use a certain dialect, the other portion of Koreans use another dialect. So division of the group, then we have similar problems like racism. But it is not based on ethnicity. It is based on dialect. So whatever we are talking about today, you can apply that to any kind of socially constructed group. But let's focus on modern racism. So this is an issue, right? But it is also true that we have made progress. Right? We have made some progress. It is not completely fixed, but it is also true that we have made some progress, right? So then what's the main characteristic of modern racism? How is it different from old-fashioned racism? What do you think? Less explicit, more subtle.
I think modern racism is more personal, like between one person and another person, whereas before it was much more institutionalized.
Oh yeah.
Personal.
Yeah.
What do you
She's okay now.
Like a company
Still.
can't be racist. A company can't say I'm not going to serve you because you're a certain ethnicity.
Okay.
But now, like, I could say, oh, I don't want to talk to you
She's
because you're a
alright.
certain ethnicity.
It's
So
usually
different.
the TA we're
So,
interacting with now.
in a
not
sense,
her.
that's more subtle.
That's why it's
It's
okay.
not,
But still.
yeah, not usually.
Right.
It may not be endorsed by institution,
Right.
but still you may see the effect among you.
Might as well take someone else.
So obviously, old-fashioned racism is much more explicit, much more negative. And then the expression of it was relatively okay previously. But this kind of racism is largely gone. Right? So today, everything is much more subtle.
Always.
It's more symbolic.
Yeah. I had
then much more indirect.
Jen can
Example is like this.
He's really laid
So
back.
in one study,
Yeah.
they recruited participants, but there are Confederate as well. But the Confederate, in one condition, is African American, the other European American, white American, and then participants. So their job is just communicating to each other over intercom. So they're just having conversation. But during the conversation, the Confederate indicate that he's having a medical emergency, seizure. Okay. This person is in need. In one condition, the Confederate is an African American. The other condition, Caucasian or European Americans. What they found is this: if the participant is the only person who can help, who can provide help, everyone help. Regardless of the ethnicity of Confederate. Like Confederate, 94% help. White Confederate, 81% help. So more than 80% provided help, much needed help. If the participant is the only person who can help. But there are other people in the experiment, then the percentage drop. In the case of black Confederate, but not so much for European American. So, in other words, they are willing to help if it is really necessary. But if it is not that necessary, then they may not. Right? So it is not actively doing something negative toward minority. But it's still some form of prejudice. Right?
Couldn't this also be related to the bystander effect?
Oh yeah. But yeah, if there are other people, then there is a diffusion of responsibility. If you are the only person who can provide help, then you will help. But if there are other people, then your responsibility is diffused. Maybe he may help, or she may help, so I don't have to, right? So that's bystander effect. But bystander effect was more pronounced for black Confederate compared to white Confederate, right? So drop is not as significant in the case of white Confederate, a huge drop in the case of black Confederate. So yes, bystander effect is there, but still some differences. Another important characteristic of modern racism or modern sexism as well is this. Not all stereotype is negative. There is some positive stereotypes as well. Right? It is not purely negative. So, for example, stereotype against Jewish people. They are competent, positive. They are smart, but they are not nice. Right? A mixture of positive and negative things. Right? Same thing for stereotype against or stereotype about women, female as well. Right? They are nicer, kinder, right? But some negative things. Right? Same thing about ethnic minority as well. Right? Then what's the problem of having positive stereotype? First of all, is it a problem to have positive stereotype as opposed to negative stereotype?
Yes.
Yes, why?
Well, like, just take, for example, like, all Asians are smart. Well, then if you're an Asian, you feel like, oh, well, then if I'm not smart, then that means I'm less of a person.
Yeah, so that's kind of simplified lies, right? So you just judge individual based on their group, right? So that's basically
You're Asian.
and then it may not be accurate, and it may impose some sort of burden on the person of being stereotyped. So that's true. What's the other thought? Why having positive stereotype can be problematic? False impression. So again, it is not accurate, right?
Like for example, you say that males are more like dominant or stronger than women, you know, like physically and stuff. But what if like a male is more empathetic? And so that could be kind of seen as negative rather than like a positive aspect, right?
I don't think I fully understand.
Like, a male's here to seem like not to be like emotional or anything else like that because they're supposed to be like somewhat of like a dominant in a relationship or something, like the alpha male. But if they are somewhat empathetic, they might be like criticized for it.
Oh,
Does that
okay.
make sense?
So positive stereotype can be a factor. They can criticize the stereotype group. Is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah.
So,
Like if they're like, even though they're like stereotyped as a certain, if they don't fit that certain stereotype, they could just seem like negative.
right, I see. So even if people have positive stereotype, if that's true, then the group member who cannot satisfy that positive stereotype may be especially criticized. Right? Another big reason why this is important is this. People with stereotype can believe that, oh, I'm not biased. Right? So having positive stereotype can be a way to justify having negative stereotype. So for example, what's the good? Maybe because I'm an Asian, I will use Asian. So Asians are not social, right? Negative. But at the same time, the person who has this belief can also say that, oh, I know they are smart. So I'm not biased. I have this balanced view, right? Right? In that way, we can maintain this not so accurate stereotype, right? Same thing is true for female, for ethnic minority. They are athletic, that's good, but they may not be that smart, right? So I'm not biased. I have this balanced view. So you can use this as a justification. Right? And then research also shows that the person who has positive stereotype is the person who also endorses negative stereotype.
For some
So they are
reason,
always going together.
I like free response.
Not perfect correlation, but
And then
significant
does
correlation.
more than multiple choice because you get more questions.
So not
And
all
they can do
stereotypes are necessarily
confusing.
negative.
Like,
Some stereotypes include positive
paid,
assessments.
this is
of
only 1 hour.
smarter, nicer,
It's 10
and more
questions, or
creative.
9. One is extra credit versus multiple
But that
choice.
can be
It's
an
an
issue.
hour.
Why?
It's more. I don't know.
This
Yeah.
can be used to justify holding other
He said he
views.
likes free response
And because of this,
Because
it's
if you-
really
you get some
difficult to
credit.
fix.
for trying. But it's less questions.
If they believe that they have biased view, then they are motivated to change it, right? Oh, I'm biased, probably I will fix it. But having this positive stereotype
Although I'm failing still.
give them a false impression that, oh, my view is balanced. So I do not have to fix anything, right? So it's really difficult to change because of this. Questions so far? Another important thing about modern racism or modern sexism is really difficult to measure. Everyone understands that explicit stereotype or explicit prejudice is wrong. Everyone admits that, right? So they may not be honest when they are answering all those questions. So if you measure explicit attitudes, then prejudice and stereotype is not a huge issue, right? But if you measure implicit attitudes, things may be slightly different. One way of measuring implicit attitude is this. IAT, do you remember this? So, young versus old, positive, negative, and make association between young and positive, old and negative. Another case, young and negative, and old and positive. So in that way, you can calculate the differences in the reaction time, then it will give you how positive or negative your attitude against old people with respect to young people. So same thing can be done with respect to gender or ethnic minority. So in this case, first one you have to do is whether the given name is more typical African American name or more typical European American or white American name. So Aliyah, more typical African American name, so you make a judgment. And then second stage, so you differentiate black American names and white American names, right? And the second stage, positive, pleasant word or unpleasant word. Suffering, negative, so you press this button as opposed to this, right? And then third stage, black names are associated with pleasant words. And white name, they are paired with unpleasant, negative words. And then they reverse. Now white name, this button, black name, this button. And then finally, here, white names are associated with positive words. Black names are associated with negative words. So comparing reaction time for this one and this one, if you have negative attitude, toward African American, then this is much easier than this. Because black names are associated with unpleasant words. Here, black or African American names are associated with positive words, so it's more difficult if you have negative attitude. Right? So comparing reaction time, we can get how much negative you may have toward African Americans with respect to European Americans. And this is implicit because in this task, they are not asked your attitude about African American. How negative are you? How positive are you? That assumption is kind of implicit. This is just reaction time task. So they were asked to just go as fast as possible. But by doing this task, their attitude may be revealed. What is really measured in this task is this. Whether do you have association between being African Americans and being negative. Whether that association is in your head, in your mind. That's essentially what this measures. Not necessarily whether you actually believe that association. For example, if you watch lots of TV dramas and TV shows, in many cases, ethnic minorities are females in those TV dramas, right? You are aware of that association. Not necessarily believe or endorse that association, but you are exposed to that association, being African Americans and being criminal, being negative. You have that association, right? Because you are aware of that association, you're just faster for this than this, regardless of whether you actually believe it or not. So if you do this kind of task, even those who do not endorse negative stereotype or negative prejudice, they still show the effect. Why? Because they are aware of that situation. They are exposed to that situation, right? So obviously, more time they are watching TV, more effect. Right? So one of the very tricky thing about modern racism or modern sexism as well, it has nothing to do with whether you actually endorse it or not. Well, it may be relevant to that, but it's really tricky. Even if they do not endorse the belief, they are aware of the belief. So you will find this effect. Even among those who actually believe that I'm very gender fair, or I do not have any racism, I strongly oppose all those negative stereotypes about ethnic minority, but still they may show this effect. So having negative association, that's something you can measure from this task. Having negative association, why is it problematic? So let's just say you have association. You are aware that there is association between being black and being negative, right? But at the same time, you consciously oppose that belief. Then is it fine? Is it okay to have just be aware of those negative associations as long as you consciously oppose it or consciously be against that belief? Having belief is one thing, but actually endorsing that belief is another, right?
Is there any way you can change your subconscious beliefs about things? I mean, I don't think so. So there's nothing you can really do about it, right?
So having belief,
Beliefs are not consistent with behavior.
right? Yeah, that's true. So although you consciously oppose all those negative stereotypes, still having that belief may influence your behavior, regardless of your true attitude, regardless of whether you endorse it or not. Just having this belief sometimes can influence your behavior. So actually, implicit attitude measured with this task can predict brain activities. Right? So amygdala activation, amygdala is a brain area that responds to emotion, but in this case, threat. If you are confronted with some sort of threat, then your amygdala will be on fire. The implicit anti-black or pro-white bias is associated with more greater activation response to black faces. So implicit attitude you saw blackface, oh, threat. Being African Americans and being negative, being dangerous, so more threat. So your brain activates. So regardless of whether you actually believe it or not, your brain responding to that kind of association. So when everything is perfect, this doesn't really matter because consciously you can go against that kind of activation. Oh, this is not right. So you can correct your initial reaction. But if you're tired, then you do not have energy to overcome this kind of initial reaction. If you're drunk, something may happen, right? Although we truly believe that you should be fair to everyone, but just having that association, because of that association, initial feeling is generated, and then you may act on those initial feelings.
Was this association only measured for white people, or was it for all of the cities across the board?
So that's a really good question. So even you administer this, for example, being black and being white, to African Americans, sometimes you do find this pro-white, anti-black.
Even for black people?
Yeah, even for black, yeah. Again, it is not about whether you actually endorse that belief
Right.
or you are aware of it.
Right.
Our social structures, unfortunately, framed in that way,
Yeah.
right? So they do have that association. So even, but the impact is particularly stronger for African American children. So they just naively absorb all these social media. Right? But if you are an adult, you can actively generate counter argument for those analogies. So the association is weaker among others, but the association is among children. Because they just passively receive all the information. Any other questions? Endorsing negative prejudice is really critical and really negative, really huge issue, but just having this association can be also problematic, regardless of whether you actually agree with it. Any questions?
Is there really any way to change that?
In ideal world, you can change social structure, right? So if you can get rid of being ethnic minority and being negative in mass media, if you can get rid of it, then everyone is kind of is not exposed to that kind of association. That may be possible in ideal world, but it's really difficult to do that. There are so many ways to justify our stereotype and prejudice, and then, well, later we are going to talk about why it is really difficult to change that. So, but first, why do we develop all those stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice? Origins of prejudice and discrimination, and possibly stereotype as well. Why?
It could be from fear or how they were raised growing up, all sorts of different things.
Why do they have fear?
They might have, might be something new that they don't understand, so it's just a defensive reaction, or it could just be, maybe they had a bad situation growing up in their childhood that affected them personally.
Yeah, fear.
This goes off what he's saying. Well, okay, where do you find fear? You find fear in bad neighborhoods and in like poverty situations. So you associate negative discrimination and prejudice with poverty and lower class situations.
Right. So scarcity of resources, right, can generate fear. In other words, there is only limited resources we can use, right? Another way of saying it is there is a competition, right? If you win in that competition, you can get resources. If you lose, then you lose, right? So there is a competition, right? Maybe between groups, right? Then, because of that, we like our in-groups and we hate out-groups. Because there is a conflict, competition. So that's one reason why we have positive attitude toward in-group, but negative attitude toward out-group. Another thought? Okay, so there are three different perspectives. One economic perspective. So there is competition. There is a conflict, real conflict. Resources are not infinite, only limited. So there is a competition between the groups. So it will give rise to negative prejudice and stereotypes. Another reason, we want to feel good about ourselves. So motivational perspective. So your self-esteem is determined by your achievement. That's true. But your self-esteem can be also influenced by performance of your in-group. So if you wanted to feel good, then your group should be better than the other. Right? And then everyone needs to feel good about themselves. So the motivational perspective. And cognitive perspective. We have learned lots of biases in terms of our cognitive processes, right? Our informational processing is not perfect. We always pursue efficiency, sometimes at the expense of accuracy, right? We just think really fast at the expense of accuracy. And then, because of that bias, we may develop stereotype and prejudice. So you are interacting with 100 people, for example. Well, I'm interacting with, in this class there are 127, 8 students. If I have to individualize every single student, the amount of information is overwhelming, right? So you have to come up with some sort of classification for efficient way of processing all those information, right? One way of doing is based on ethnicity or based on gender. Oh, male students in my class. Oh, female students in my class. Oh, European American students in my class. Asian Americans in my class. African Americans in my class. So I can make this kind of classification for efficiency. But they may not be accurate, right? Because we have lots of cognitive biases. So there are three perspectives in terms of why we have stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. One, economic perspective. There is a competition, competition, conflict, real fight between groups. Motivation, we want to feel good about our in-group as opposed to out-group. And then our reasoning or our cognitive process is not perfect. So we are going to talk about this perspective one by one. So first, economic perspective. So according to this perspective, or according to this theory, the main reason why we have stereotype is this: competition for scarce resources. Resources may be physical, tangible, and economic, but it can be conceptual as well. Status, right? not just money or food. Those tangible resources are important, but symbolic resources are also important. Status, prestige, things like that. So obviously, if they feel that they have the most to lose, they have extreme view against the other. More to lose and more to hate. So historically, greater hostility is directed toward immigrants during economic recessions, limited resources, and then they are coming after them. And then we are threatened, so negatively. So scarcity of resources really, really closely tied with prejudice and stereotype. When everything is fine, then it's okay to come to our country. But if it is not, then that may be a threat. So one classic study that is really relevant to this perspective is this. So here, participants were kids, right? So it's a summer camp. They recruited children for summer camp. And then they divided children into two different groups, eagles and red-rose. During the first week of summer camp, there is total isolation. Each group, they does not know that there is the other group. So eagles believe that eagles are the only group in the summer camp. Rattlers, they believe that rattlers are the only group in the summer camp. They are not aware of the other group. Okay? During this first week, they are working together, so they develop cohesiveness, or solidarity within each group. So after this first week, they became a cohesive group. We are eagles, and then the other group, we are rattlers. Right? And then during the second week, there was a competition between these two groups. Tug of war between these two groups, and then winners can have better food, better place to sleep, things like that. So real competition between these two groups. So obviously, the result, they hate each other. Lots of stereotypes and lots of prejudice. They generated lots of stereotypes about the other group, and they really hate them, and then they do discriminate the other group. During the third week, these two groups started working together. So it is not a competitive task. They have to collaborate to achieve the goal. So collaboration. So after the third week, negative stereotype, negative prejudice, discrimination significantly dropped because they have a common goal, because they have to work together. So one lesson from this study is this. Interracial contact itself may not be sufficient. During the second week, they met. They are exposed to each other. But the result is really negative. Why? Because the setting is competitive. Right? The third week, all those negative problems decreased. Why? The setting was collaborative. So they have to work together. So gender, ethnic minority, just meeting each other, that's not sufficient. The interaction should be positive. The interaction should be, they have to rely on each other. working together. That's important. I mean, desegregation is important. That's kind of first step, but that's not the perfect method. Putting all those different people into the same class, result can be positive or negative, depending on the setting. That's one thing you can learn from this. So having collective goal is really a key factor to fix this problem. Then you can see the kind of solidarity among military soldiers. So there are a lot of different races, but when there is a war, then group solidarity, cohesiveness really increases. Having common enemy or having collective goal always helpful to fix this problem. The second is motivational perspective. So it is not about conflict. Even when there is no conflict, or even there is no real competition, we may develop positive attitude toward in-group and negative attitude toward out-group. Why? We are motivated to feel good about ourselves. And then our identity, part of our identity, is tied with our in-group. Personal identity is important, but collective identity, me as a European American or me as an African American, that's an important aspect of our identity. So in order to feel good about ourselves, we are motivated to have a positive view about in-group, but negative view about out-group. So key differences here is this. Real competition or conflict is not necessary. Just dividing them into two different groups, that's enough. That's enough to generate stereotype and prejudice. So for example, one simple thing. So how many dots here? That's the question. How many dots here? Guess. You cannot count this. So how many? 20, 30. 17. So I don't know the correct answer, but this is what the researcher asked participants to do. Make a guess. And then they gave a forced feedback. Oh, you overestimate the number of dots. So you belong to overestimator group. In another condition, for another participants, they said, oh, you underestimate the number of dots. So you belong to underestimate group. So they divide participants into two different groups, randomly, arbitrarily, right? So there is no reason to believe that one is better than the other, right? This is one paradigm. Another paradigm is something like this. Abstract pictures. Participants saw two different abstract pictures. Which one do you like more? Some people say A, some people say B, and they divide the group between them. Right? And there is no real interaction between these groups. No competition, not whatsoever. Just divide people into two different groups based on really superficial things like this. How many dots here? And research shows that this division of group is enough to generate stereotype and prejudice, in-group bias. That's minimal group paradigm. Group is divided based on superficial or minimal factor. Right? Even then, people like their in-group and people hate the other group. So you are told that, oh, you belong to overestimator. Then you may think that, oh, those people in this group, they are nicer, they are smarter than the other groups. But if you belong to underestimator, then you may believe, oh, they are better than overestimator. So just division of group itself is enough. group category sometimes defined along very arbitrary or superficial dimension. But if given a chance to distribute rewards across two different groups, then participants prefer to give more in-group than the out-group. Although that classification is really arbitrary and superficial. Even striking finding is this. So you are overestimator, and then you can make a choice. If you pick option A, everyone in your group will get $7, and everyone in the other group will get $3. But if you pick option B, then everyone gets $10. Rationality says B is much better option. You can get more money, $10 as opposed to 7, right? But study shows that people tend to choose this. Why? Maximize the difference between two groups. Well, I will get $4 more than the others. Here, no difference between groups. Even though you can personally get more money, $10 as opposed to 7, but still people tend to choose this one. So they wanted to maximize the difference, even at the expense of their own benefits. And then remember that the group is divided superficially. There is no competition, no interaction whatsoever. Just division of group is enough to generate this. Why? Because social identity is really important. We have motivation to feel good about ourselves, and social identity or collective identity, I belong to this group. That's an important aspect of our identity. So our group, my group, should be better than the other. So we have in-group bias. In-group is better. And then we wanted to bask in the reflective world. Because my group is really doing well, probably I'm good as well. Not just having positive view about the in-group, but having negative view about out-group can be helpful as well. Derogation is also very effective in terms of maintaining positive self-esteem. So for example, so the study is done in the time when there is anti-Semitism. So prejudice against Jewish people. Right? So, participants in this study, first, they completed IQ test. They did IQ test. And then they were given forced feedback. Regardless of their actual performance, they were given forced feedback. In one condition, positive feedback. Oh, you have really high IQ. Another condition, you are not so smart. Your IQ is really low. So they are threatened. Right? In one condition, boost in self-esteem. Oh, I'm very smart. And then decrease in self-esteem. Oh, I'm not that smart. Right? That's the two different conditions. And then they move on to another experiment. In this experiment, what they have to is forming impression of a person. Right? One of them is Jewish, the other non-Jewish candidate, and then their evaluation. What they found was this. First, After receiving negative feedback, so I'm not smart, I'm threatened, much more negative attitude toward out-group members, Jewish people, minority group, more negative. But non-Jewish candidate, no difference. Whether they are, regardless of whether they are threatened or not, no difference for majority candidate. So if they are threatened, they derogate ethnic minority. The question is whether this is really effective to boost their threatened self-esteem. That's the question, and that's the case. After giving negative feedback, there is increase in self-esteem. So I'm not smart, so I'm really depressed, but Jewish people, they are really, really bad. So compared to them, I may be okay. So derogating out-group members, ethnic minorities, can be helpful in terms of boosting their self-esteem. So how this works is this. So you are threatened, hate the other group, derogating the other group, then your self-esteem may be maintained, may be boosted. Right? That's what this is. So according to this view, negative stereotype and prejudice is related to our motivation to feel good about ourselves. Having positive view about in-group, helpful, and then having negative view about out-group, it can be also helpful. If your goal is maintaining positive self-view, right? As you can see in this experiment. Any question? So one interesting category. So any person can belong to multiple groups, right? For example, think about African American doctor. Doctor, upper middle class, prestigious, and then African American ethnic minority. So there is conflict here, right? And then how people classify this African American doctor as an African American, as an ethnic minority, or as a doctor, upper middle class, right? It depends on your self-esteem, whether you are threatened or not. So basically, I will just skip this study. It's complicated, but the essential finding is this. If you are threatened, and then you are European Americans, then you believe African American doctor is another African American. But if your self-esteem is not threatened, you have positive feedback after IQ test, then you think that, oh, this African American doctor is a doctor, as opposed to it's another African. Right? So essentially, this finding is similar to this one. Whether you are threatened or not, your attitudes can change, right? Depending on your motivation. So basically what we talked about so far is this. Threatened, negative attitude, right? So that's basically this. Frustration, aggression. If you are frustrated, you can be more aggressive. So that's frustration, aggression. So feelings of frustration, feelings of being threatened. It's related to aggression and then motivation for prejudice. So important thing is here, the ethnic minority is not the source of threat. Remember the experiment. You are told that you are not smart. Right? That negative feedback has nothing to do with Jewish people, right? Our group members. Has nothing to do with it, but because of that threat, they develop this negative attitude, right? So once frustrated or once threatened, we just wanted to release that frustration by attacking our group members. Even when that out member has nothing to do with the frustration. So obviously it may be safer to target aggression at individuals or groups that are lower in power. That's why we do have this ethnic minority problem in virtually all societies. There are always threats. There are always frustration, and that threat and frustration is toward minorities. So there's a paper called Kicking the Barking Bird. If your boss, you are frustrated at your work, you are really frustrated, really aggressive, and then when you come home, maybe this may happen. Like a dog has nothing to do with your frustration, but so historically, when the economy goes down, a lot more problems. Right? For example, when cotton prices were low, more lynching or more problems, even though they have nothing to do with lower price of cotton. So evaluating motivation perspective. So compared to economic perspective, you need to understand the difference between them. Economic perspective, there is a competition, not just division of the group, but competition or conflict is important, right? From motivational perspective, no. Competition or conflict is not necessary. Dividing people into two different groups or several groups, that's enough. That's motivational perspective. Once you divide people into different groups, they start liking in-group but hating out-groups. Probably because of their self-esteem. Because they want to have motivation to feel good about themselves. And then unfortunately, derogating out-group members is helpful to maintain positive feelings. As you can see in the previous study. Right? Derogating Jewish people lead to increase in self-esteem. So that's motivation perspective. And then we are going to talk about cognitive perspective next class. But you need to submit your thought paper next Tuesday. So you have to write a paper using chapters 9, 10, 11. Thought paper next week.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, it barely comes. I just want to go take a nap.
So Dawn wants to hang out this weekend, and I'm like,
Oh.